Stop what you're doing. Newly recovered material now raising the possibility of a second gunman has reopened raw questions about one of the nation's most shocking political killings. If you want first-hand updates on this developing story and others, hit subscribe and turn on the bell now. From the earliest hours after the shooting, authorities presented a tightly packaged explanation. A single assailant, a bolt-action rifle, a rooftop vantage point, and a suspect quickly identified, apprehended, and charged. In the chaotic days after a public killing, it is understandable, and often necessary, for police to advance a working theory that explains the immediate facts. A clear narrative helps coordinate investigations, directs forensic work, and gives the public a sense of order in a moment of shock. But the way an official narrative is constructed matters. The lone shooter framing did more than describe a hypothesis. It shaped investigative priorities, influenced which pieces of evidence were highlighted, and set public expectations about responsibility and motive. The community's appetite for a swift resolution is human and understandable, yet that same appetite can inadvertently narrow the focus of investigators, closing off lines of inquiry that don't fit the neat explanation. That dynamic is not unique to this case. Many high-profile crimes show how early certainty can harden into institutional momentum that is hard to redirect. What complicates matters here is that the lone shooter framing was bolstered by what appeared to be strong, physical evidence tying a single individual to the weapon and the scene. Police reported DNA and a partially burned note connected to the rifle, and an arrest followed. These kinds of forensic links are powerful. They create a factual backbone prosecutors can present in court and that the public can point to as proof of a clear chain of events. But forensic connections also need context. DNA can persist, move, or be transferred, notes can be planted or altered under uncertain conditions, and the presence of a person near a weapon does not by itself answer how many shooters were involved or whether others interfered. The problem arises when alternative leads are downplayed or when witness reports that conflict with the official frame are characterized as unreliable too quickly. The newly surfaced footage and audio suggest that those alternative leads were present from the beginning. If that is true, investigators' early choices about where to concentrate effort may explain why certain questions linger. Forensic evidence is the kind of thing that anchors criminal cases. In this situation, investigators reported finding DNA and a half-burned piece of paper that they said connected the accused to the weapon used in the attack. Those discoveries have a way of crystallizing suspicions into charges. DNA can indicate physical contact. A note can indicate intent or connection. Taken together, they create a powerful forensic tableau that prosecutors can translate into probable cause, arrest warrants, and ultimately indictment. But forensic findings also require careful explanation. DNA is compelling because it is highly individualized, yet the science does not operate in a vacuum. Context matters. Where was the DNA recovered exactly? Was it on the rifle's exterior surfaces, on packaging, or on ancillary paraphernalia? How was the chain of custody preserved between discovery and analysis? The half-burned note raises similarly crucial questions. What did it say? How far was it burned? Where was it found in relation to the weapon? Could it have been placed or altered after the fact? These are not speculative queries. They are the kinds of procedural and scientific details that determine the reliability of evidence in court. Investigators who rush to make these connections public may have done so to prevent panic and to reassure the community that progress was being made. There is practical sense in showing that investigators are on the trail of physical proof rather than conjecture. But the downside is that strongly publicized forensic claims can anchor an investigation's public narrative even before alternatives have been explored fully. If other evidence contradicts or complicates these physical links, the public's pre-existing acceptance of DNA note findings can create resistance to reorienting the inquiry. It is also worth noting that forensic evidence alone rarely tells an entire story of criminal events. DNA can show contact. It cannot always specify time, intent, or the presence of accomplices. A note may suggest planning, but notes can be ambiguous, misattributed, or even staged. That is why the forensic enterprise must be integrated with scene reconstruction, witness interviews, digital timelines, and other forms of evidence. The new footage and audio raise precisely the kinds of context that could either reconcile with or contradict the early forensic picture. Investigators must now account for both sets of data, the DNA and note that pointed to one person, and the audiovisual material that raises the prospect of another presence at the scene. In the wake of any mass shooting, eyewitnesses are both vital and complicated sources. People experience events from different vantage points, under stress, often with limited visibility. In this case, a significant number of students and community members reported hearing gunfire coming from multiple directions on the night in question. That pattern of testimony is important because it directly challenges the single origin hypothesis. When dozens of people, even if their statements differ in detail, independently report multiple points of origin, investigators should, as a matter of course, treat those accounts as potentially actionable. The human ear can be confused in chaotic environments. Echoes, reverberation, and the adrenaline spike after a sudden noise can distort perception. But human perception is not uniformly unreliable. When combined with other data, camera footage, ballistic trajectories, acoustic analysis, witness accounts become indispensable. In the days after the shooting, some of those accounts were dismissed or sidelined as confused or mistaken. The question now is whether those dismissals were premature. Communities interpret events through a cultural lens. Students who knew the campus, the nearby buildings, and typical sightlines are often quick to notice when something in an environment feels off. Reports of shots from different directions were not just casual observations. They reflected a shared experience of disorientation and fear. For many residents, the possibility that multiple shooters could have been involved is terrifying because it implies a level of coordination they had not expected in their community. That fear creates pressure for rapid answers, but it also demands rigorous inquiry. The interplay between local testimony and institutional response shaped how the story unfolded publicly. Early on, the official narrative of a lone shooter appeared to displace the multiplicity of witness reports. For families listening, that displacement was painful. People who said they had heard gunfire from different directions felt ignored. This dynamic fuels distrust. Trust is essential in investigations that require community cooperation. When the public senses that important observations are discounted, they may opt out of providing further information or become more prone to alternative narratives that fill the void. A recovered security camera became the fulcrum of controversy when footage surfaced showing an additional, brief flash consistent with a gunshot during the same hour as the shooting. Visual evidence of that sort is striking because it offers an objective record that can be repeatedly examined, slowed down, and time-synced to other material. If the flash corresponds to gunfire, it creates a tangible anchor for rethinking the event's chronology. Cameras are not perfect. Flash artifacts can be caused by other sources such as lighting changes, reflection, or electronic noise. That is why footage requires corroboration through frame-by-frame analysis and cross-referencing with other evidence. In this situation, analysts who reviewed the recovered clip identified the flash's timing as coincident with moments in which other witnesses reported hearing additional shots. Importantly, the camera's angle and the shadows in the footage hinted at activity in a portion of the scene not focal in earlier investigations. The circumstances of how the footage was recovered and why it was not part of the original evidence package raise procedural concerns. Security systems on and around campuses are often maintained by a patchwork of university services, private businesses, and municipal entities. That fragmentation can create blind spots in evidence collection. If a camera that recorded a key moment was overlooked, lost, or not promptly preserved, questions arise about the thoroughness of the initial canvas. Investigators are responsible for identifying every potential recorder in the vicinity, from doorbells to private surveillance, and ensuring that material is secured. Delays or oversights in that process can significantly affect the evidentiary record. The recovered footage does more than show a flash. It also creates new investigative avenues. It provides a timestamp that can be cross-checked against cell phone videos, audio spikes, and digital logs. It allows investigators to model possible shooter positions with greater precision. And crucially, it may suggest that more than one weapon fired in the period surrounding the primary shot. That possibility complicates the prosecution's case in ways both factual and doctrinal. If another actor discharged a weapon in proximate time and space, questions of complicity, coordination, or separate culpability will need careful legal examination. Acoustic forensics is a specialized field that can distinguish between single shots and multiple discharges, identify the likely origins of sounds, and separate genuine detonations from echoes or environmental noise. In this instance, forensic audio analysts reported multiple distinct gunfire spikes in recordings from the relevant hour, spikes that cannot be readily explained as echoes or recording artifacts. That analytic finding is consequential because it provides a scientific basis for what witnesses heard and what the camera briefly hinted at visually. Sound behaves in predictable ways, but complex environments, with buildings, open spaces, and reflective surfaces, produce complicated acoustic signatures. Analysts use models that account for arrival times, frequency content, and the geometry of the environment to make judgments about the likely number and source locations of shots. When audio from several devices lines up, when spikes occur at specific timestamps across different recorders, the probability that those spikes represent genuine, separate discharges increases. The implications are stark. If multiple, distinct shots are confirmed acoustically, the single-shooter theory becomes less dispositive. Acoustic evidence may help map where shots came from, which can then be compared to ballistic analysis and wound trajectories. It can also identify whether shots are clustered in tight succession, suggesting the same weapon, or spread in a pattern consistent with different firings. The forensic audio evidence in this case reportedly shows discrete spikes incompatible with simple echo explanations, a technical determination that pushes investigators to take claims of multiple shooters more seriously. There are legal and procedural caveats. Acoustic forensics must be defensible in court, with transparent methods and clear explanations of uncertainty. Defense teams can and will challenge the assumptions behind acoustic conclusions. Were the devices synchronized correctly? Were environmental noises mischaracterized? Did the analysts account for all possible confounders? Robust, peer-reviewed techniques and clear chain of custody documentation are critical to ensure that audio evidence survives adversarial testing. Beyond isolated flashes and audio spikes, observers who reviewed the recovered camera footage reported seeing a shadowed figure moving away from an area adjacent to the main event. The image is not high-definition cinematic evidence. Rather, it is a fleeting silhouette at the edge of a frame. Nonetheless, when that silhouette is examined alongside the timing of the audio spikes and other recordings, it becomes more than an ambiguous shape. It is a lead worth pursuing. Video frames at low light often produce indistinct shapes that can be misread. Clothing, posture, and momentary lighting can suggest movement where none existed. Yet investigators know that even a blurry silhouette can trace avenues of inquiry. That image can determine direction of travel, provide an estimate of clothing and body type, and identify a likely route that person took. Combined with doorbell footage, cell phone captures, and physical traces like footprints or discarded items, a shadowed figure can turn from a tantalizing hint into an actionable suspect description. What matters in a legal and investigative sense is corroboration. If that silhouette's timing lines up with acoustic evidence of another discharge, if it matches witness descriptions of someone moving away from a building, or if it aligns with other surveillance that captures the same person from a different angle, the probability that the figure is relevant grows. Conversely, if no corroboration materializes, the figure could remain an insufficiently identified object in the record. The recovered footage, therefore, acts primarily as a pointer. It suggests where to look next, not a final answer. Investigators also have to grapple with the procedural question of why this figure was not identified sooner. Was the footage from a camera that was inaccessible, damaged, or simply overlooked during the initial canvass? Were private property owners slow to produce their recordings? These procedural gaps matter because time degrades evidence. Digital files can be overwritten, physical traces can be cleaned away, and memories fade. The sight of a shadowed figure thus raises both factual and institutional questions. What did the footage show, and why was it not part of the immediate inquiry? One of the most painful dimensions of this unfolding story is not simply the possibility of another shooter, but the timing and manner in which investigators acknowledged the new material. Family members and supporters say they were left waiting for days without clear answers. In criminal investigations, timing is not merely bureaucratic, it is psychological and moral. Families in mourning expect transparency and swifter communication about material that might explain what happened to their loved one. When information emerges gradually, or when evidence appears to have been delayed or withheld, that silence compounds grief. There are plausible operational reasons investigations proceed in quiet. Authorities might keep some leads confidential to preserve integrity, avoid compromising sources, or shield an ongoing manhunt. In some instances, public disclosure can undermine witness cooperation or alert potential co-conspirators. Yet the optics of silence are often the problem. When a grieving family hears about critical material, a camera clip, acoustic analysis, witness corroboration, through secondary channels or after days of official quiet, trust erodes quickly. Delay also has practical consequences. The early days after a major crime are the most fertile for gathering evidence. Physical traces are fresh, potential witnesses' memories are sharper, and the investigative perimeter stands less likely to have been disturbed. If procedural slowdowns or prioritization choices led to lost opportunities, cameras not secured, interviews not conducted promptly, private recordings overwritten, those losses cannot be undone. Families understandably ask why certain avenues were not pursued sooner and whether institutional constraints prevented fuller, faster inquiry. Beyond procedure, there is moral accountability. Investigative agencies are accountable to the public, to victims' families, and to the rule of law. That accountability includes timely, clear communication about what is known, what remains unknown, and what steps are being taken. Silence or delayed acknowledgement can be framed as necessary caution, but it is nonetheless experienced by families as exclusion from a process that should center their need for answers. As new footage and analysis surface, those feelings of exclusion become more acute and harder to soothe. When new, objective material appears, a camera clip, audio confirmation, or synchronized timestamps, it changes how earlier witness statements are evaluated. Accounts once dismissed as confused or inconsistent can fall into place when matched against a fresh timeline. The phenomenon is not unusual in complex investigations. Human memory is fallible, but when multiple streams of evidence converge, the mosaic becomes clearer. For people who were on the scene and felt unheard, the re-evaluation of their testimony is vindicating. Witnesses who once feared being dismissed now see their observations corroborated by scientific analysis. That shift can produce both relief and renewed trauma. Relief that their voice mattered, trauma in having remembered something distressing that was ignored when it could have been acted upon. From an investigative standpoint, revisiting witness statements is both necessary and methodical. Analysts can resync statements to new timestamps, identify who was looking in which direction at what moment, and reconcile contradictory claims by understanding the constraints of each witness's vantage point. In many cases, the combined effect of multiple partial accounts yields a fuller picture than any single testimony could. In this case, the convergence of witness reports with the recovered footage and forensic audio increases the credibility of earlier claims about multiple firing points and extra movement near the crime scene. That said, revisiting testimony raises procedural and legal questions. Defense attorneys will emphasize inconsistencies and the risk of memory contamination when witnesses hear new public claims before being re-interviewed. Investigators must therefore document their methods carefully, maintain independent contemporaneous records, and avoid leading witnesses as they reconstruct the timeline. A rigorous, transparent process will be vital to ensure that old testimony, newly corroborated, can withstand adversarial scrutiny in court. When institutions, be they universities, private property owners, or investigative bodies, fail to act promptly, the costs are tangible. The fragmented nature of surveillance on and around campus spaces creates vulnerabilities. Cameras belong to different entities, maintenance schedules vary, and the obligation to preserve footage is not uniform. If material was not preserved or promptly turned over because of confusion about responsibility or because of bureaucratic inertia, that procedural silence becomes an active component of the evidence problem. Institutional silence also has a reputational dimension. Universities that hope to avoid scandal by managing information tightly may find that withholding or delaying evidence invites suspicion. Investigative agencies that withhold explanation on grounds of tactical advantage may inadvertently appear to be protecting incompetence. In either case, the result is a loss of public confidence at a moment when confidence is essential to securing cooperation and building an evidentiary record. The relevant question is not simply who was silent, but why, and whether that silence was avoidable. Was there a failure of interagency communication? Did legal constraints slow down the sharing of digital files? Did private owners fear liability and therefore delay handing over footage? Answering these institutional questions is as important as answering the factual ones about shooter identity. Where procedural breakdowns occurred, reforms will be necessary to prevent similar problems in future cases. For the family and the public, institutional silence feels like protection of negligence. Even if that is not a fair characterization in every instance, the perception is politically and emotionally charged. Restoring trust will require both clear accounting of what happened and tangible steps to ensure future transparency, protocols for preserving evidence, mandated points of contact for emergency recordings, and legal avenues to compel timely production of material in investigations of public significance. At the center of this unfolding story is a family living with an incomplete account of what happened to their loved one. For them, justice is not only a legal outcome, it is the restoration of a coherent truth. The newly surfaced evidence promises a fuller account but also complicates the path forward. If another shooter was present, who acted, who aided, and why did initial investigators miss or downplay that possibility? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are prosecutable facts that must be answered through diligent inquiry. Justice requires confronting silence, procedural missteps, and institutional blind spots without letting the desire for rapid closure trump the need for thoroughness. The legal standard, guilt proven beyond reasonable doubt, remains demanding and rightly so. But the public demand for truth is equally urgent. Family members want to know whether the full circle of responsibility has been identified and whether the system will pursue every credible lead. Above all, remember the human dimension. Behind videotapes, acoustical charts, and procedural memos are a grieving family and a community seeking closure. True justice will depend on confronting inconvenient facts, correcting course where mistakes were made, and making transparency and rigor the priority over quick comfort. If the newly recovered footage points to a second shooter, the nation must not settle for tidy narratives. It must pursue the full truth, for the sake of the law, for the sake of the family, and for the integrity of the public sphere.